Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Forward Podcast. I'm your host, Lance Armstrong. If you're listening to this episode, this will make no sense to you. If you're watching it on YouTube or Facebook, yes, I am on a bike ride, in the middle of a bike ride. I just rode down here and recording this intro, and I'm going to keep riding. So that's why I'm wearing bike clothes, and my hair looks like shit. Anyways, that's just it. My guest this week is actually an old friend of mine. Not an old friend of mine, but somewhat of an old friend of mine. A really good guy by the name of Roger Pielke. So Roger is a professor of ethics at the University of Colorado Boulder. I've spoken at his class a few times. Really enjoy his time. Really come to respect not just his intellect, but also his fairness and neutrality on a lot of issues, and just his objectiveness. And so today we're going to talk primarily about the Caster Semenya case, which was just arbitrated over at CAS, the Court of Arbitration in Sport in Switzerland. Unfortunately for her, she lost that case and is now no longer allowed to compete as a woman. So the discussion is really in and around, as I told Roger, the more I studied for this podcast, the more confused I got. I mean, as you start to learn about intersex humans and X and Y chromosomes and boys and girls and testosterone levels, and then lay over that the rules and regulations of the governing bodies, IAAF, and then the arbitrary or the arbitration panel over at CAS. It's just a confusing case, and there's really net there's no winners. She certainly didn't win. I don't think IAAF ends up winning. I think they look bad. CAS doesn't win because it showcases just the biased nature of that court. It didn't work. And so, but he sheds a really interesting light on it. And then also, full disclosure, he was her expert witness at her arbitration over in Switzerland. So he did spend the week with her and got to know her quite well, and has, I suspect, stronger opinions on this, but you'll see he's a very fair man, and it was a fascinating discussion. We also do in the end get into, he covers ethics on environmental studies, ethics on politics, ethics on doping. So all of those things come into this discussion, which I didn't think we'd get to, but we did, and it was equally as fascinating. Last thing before we get to Roger, since I am on a bike, so as I was riding down here, I had my headphone in and I was listening to the Tour of Italy stage, the finish, and there were, if something exciting would happen, I would pull over and watch, and then made my way here. But I'm not covering the Tour of Italy daily. However, The Move, the second podcast of this enterprise, is. And so JB Hager is still running the show there, as well as another JB, Johan Brunel. So slight twist in that it's more Johan than me, and also a slight twist in that it's more of a preview, tactical, strategic show, talking about strategy and tactics about what's going to happen in the days to come, as opposed, there is a recap, but as opposed to a full recap show. So Johan, who I view as being the best in the business when it comes to running strategy and tactics in cycling, is giving his perspective on the Tour of Italy. And I'm going to hop in there from time to time whenever it allows. So thanks for tuning in. If you want to check that one out, that's over on iTunes and all the other channels. It's called The Move. And then, we just got 6 weeks until the tour where we really ramp it up. So thanks for tuning in. Enjoy Roger Pielke, and talk to y'all soon. Roger, thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
We're going to spend most of the time talking about Caster Semenya.
Yeah.
But before we get into this, I just want to educate the listeners on a little bit about what it is you do in your real life.
Yeah. Well,
day to day.
I'm a professor, so it's kind of removed from real life. I study for a long time, like 20, 25 years, the use and misuse of science and decision making. And for a long time, I worked in areas of science like environmental science and energy policy. And about a decade ago, I started working on sports issues. Actually started, the two topics I started working on were Caster Semenya after 2009 in Berlin when she hit the international scene, and Oscar Pistorius, the guy who ran on blades, now's in jail.
Yep.
So
That's a bad story.
Yeah, it's a really bad
You
story.
have a real affinity for the South Africans, it sounds like.
Seems like it, yeah.
And so you teach at University of Colorado.
Yep, in Boulder.
And just so the listeners know, and I've put some of these pictures up in the past, but I've come and talked to your class a few times. I always love that.
Yep, come a couple times, always a hit with the kids.
Fill that room and, start, saying a bunch of outrageous things. They love it. I tell people, I love, because in the last couple of years, I've had the opportunity to talk at other universities. And so anywhere from Harvard kids, and I just did the Stanford Sports Innovation Conference, and here at the University of Texas. But the difference between a CU class and a Stanford class, because a lot of times I say the same stuff, full admission, it's just amazing that the reaction, the difference in the reaction between the kids. It's
What's the difference?
Those Ivy League schools, they just don't laugh nearly as much. So the stuff that is going to get a laugh.
Right.
At Stanford, they're like, huh. I'm like, come on.
Right.
That's it?
Right,
That's all I get?
Right.
So let's get into the Semenya case, Caster Semenya. And for those listening who don't know, a lot of you will, I've been following this story, not as closely, obviously, as you and others, but you have a runner, an 800-meter runner from South Africa who's head and shoulders above everybody else. When she first came on the scene, everybody suspected that she was either a guy or some sort of a mixed chromosomal situation. And now it's been out there forever. I thought it was settled and everybody's like, all right, we're over it. We'll let her just run. But no, I mean, it didn't. In fact, it went to a big hearing at the Court of Arbitration for Sport, otherwise known as CAS, recently. But as I prepared for this and read a lot of yesterday and all morning today, normally when I read up on these things, I get a pretty clear picture of what has happened. The more I read, the more confused I get. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I tell my students exactly that. That's a sign of education. It's a complicated issue. There's legitimate views on all sides of it. Mm-hmm. And the more you learn about it, the more shades of gray, more confusing it gets. So I tell my students, you might not get answers, but you'll be confused at a much higher level of understanding.
There you go. That's where I'm currently residing.
Yep.
But to just get into it, so she and as I started, and I was learning all these things today about, men have X chromosomes, women have Y chromosomes. Some people have XXY, some people have XY, some people have YXX. So she's XY.
That's under the regulations. So it's really complicated because individual athletes' medical information is not supposed to be out there in public. And
we're going to get to that because they leaked her medical file.
Absolutely.
This is what
But the regulations that she falls under would only apply to what are called 46XY females. So
okay.
Yes. So it's
who leaked the file?
So her medical history was leaked, a decade ago when it first was an issue, and it had to have come from the IAAF, which oversees track and field, because they're the ones that had it. It was leaked to an Australian newspaper about a decade ago.
Yeah, but it's confirmed that she is indeed XY.
Yeah, if she falls under the regulations and she took it to CAS, then we can presume safely that she falls under and she's XY.
And she was raised a female. Mm-hmm. She believes she's a female. She runs as a female. And I've asked a lot of strange questions on this show. I never thought I'd ask this question, but she has female genitalia. That's a question.
We don't know what she's packing in her drawers. And that's one of the issues in this case is, should we know? Should we want to know? Does it even matter? And one thing to dispense of right at the beginning, and this is what blows people's minds, because in 5th grade biology or whatever, you learn that men are XY and women are XX. And it turns out that for the vast majority of people, that works just fine. Mm-hmm. But there are some folks where, and you said it up front, there's XXY, there's XX males, there's XY females. It's really complicated.
Yep.
And that's why this issue's so fascinating, because the world doesn't divide into just, black and white. There's a big shade of gray in the middle, and that's where this issue takes place.
Right, but the world does divide in the sports world, there's girls events and boys events, and boys race with boys and girls race with girls, and so that's clear. the argument, I think it comes down to, the biggest argument is her ability or her natural level of testosterone, which is apparently elevated.
Yeah. So this is, again, where it gets, first thing is you're exactly right. It's the sports world's clear. Male, female categories,
right.
Sharp line between them. And the real world, shades of gray. So how do you map that shade of gray onto this two-part athletics world? So there is a little bit of a history here because this is the second go-round in the last decade for IAAF on these regulations. The first go-round, they tried to regulate testosterone. And what they did was they said that, all right, if a woman, and we're only talking about women, if a woman has too much testosterone, they came up with a threshold, she can't compete with other women. An Indian sprinter named Duty Chand challenged that, and she won.
Right.
So they threw out the testosterone regulations. And so IAAF came back, and now they're not regulating testosterone. They're regulating 46XY females.
Yep.
So they've shifted from a condition that you might have to a characteristic that you have, which has caused a lot of the outrage about this issue.
Right, but let's... And again, a lot of these are just questions because for the life of me, as I said, I'm getting more and more confused. If anybody, man or woman, has an elevated testosterone, either naturally or artificially, at some point, and again, for the listener, testosterone is tested a lot like cortisone. There's a threshold, right? Anything below that, you're negative. Anything above that, you're positive. She's never been above that threshold. She's never tested positive. That's a question.
Right. So what we're talking about here is endogenous or naturally occurring testosterone. So that there's no limit. That doesn't even show up, and it's not even related to the doping question at all. So there's never been a question raised about her exceeding any limits or failing any testing related.
Never failed a test.
Never.
Okay.
So that's that. I think everyone's pretty clear that's at least is off the table because early on, and this has happened in the past with a lot of women because the sex testing issue goes back 50 years or more. Doping was always the first thing suspected because of how they looked or how their performance. And in Caster's case, that's fortunately
science lesson for me this morning. The threshold is 5 per liter.
Right.
That's what. And anything below that, you get to race as a girl, you have to race as a boy.
Yes. For 4 different events.
Because then it gets even, folks, just wait, it gets even more confusing.
Right.
Where is she on that scale? And as I read here on all these...
just as...
Do we know where she is?
Since she falls into be above that 5. I think that's very safe to say.
Is it 5.5 or is it 50?
We don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know, and we don't know if it's close to 5. We don't know if it's
why don't we know?
It's her private medical information.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing that... athletes, you know how this is, don't want to release their medical information for a lot of reasons.
I'm curious, like what it is. Like, right. I'm going to be as neutral as I can during this podcast, which is rare. I normally take a position. I just can't figure it out. But I guess if I knew, like if it was 5.1, I'd be like, all right, well, let's move on here.
Right.
If it's 50. Or 30, right. I guess you might look at it differently.
So the distribution that the IAAF has published has something like the quote unquote normal range for males is like 7 to 27.
Right.
So that's why they selected 5, as they say, well, it's well below the male range and well above the typical female range.
You know what this is a slight departure, but I found it also fascinating because I must admit I never watched women run half miles. Mm-hmm. Did when I ran track in high school, but I know her story and I know that she's very dominant. I mean, she crushes these other girls. I want to get into that in a second too because I also had heard that the silver and bronze medalists from the last Olympic Games also have split chromosomes, but. As I started to research the women's 800 meters, I looked at the top 25 times of all time. Have you looked at this list?
Yeah.
So she does not have she doesn't have the world record.
Right.
But when you watch her run, you're like, oh, that's a world record. Like she killed those girls. Right. She doesn't have the world record. And as you looked at the top 25 times and all the different times and the years they were achieved, 17 of the top 25 happened before 1987.
Yeah.
And then you go starting looking at these women. I mean, if the IAAF wants to make shit right, you might want to start
with East Germans.
I mean, and just the fact that it's been 30 years since anybody even ran, she's up to, what is she's like, maybe fourth or fifth?
Yeah. She has some of the top times.
But if they're going to go like change history and set precedent, and they're going to hammer this girl's life like that, you might want to take it a whole nother step further. Well, anyways,
yeah, we
won't go down that rabbit hole. But it just shows you what that era was like in track and field, not just for men, but for also right. for women. Let's talk about the. Is it indeed a fact? I have so many questions. These women that got I wrote Neon Saba got the silver medal.
Yeah.
From bronze. So I went and looked at their Wikipedia page. No mention of right. being XY, whatever. But I read it in some of these articles that they too have this. Is that?
Yeah, that's the general scene. Neon Saba from Burundi has come out in support of also would fall under the regulations. I don't publicly said anything. She's expressed her support for Caster, but it's widely she would fall under the regulations also.
So what's their fate?
So they pay to get.
Or they have to take the test to see if they're right. below or above
right.
5.
Right.
It's so confusing. Everybody I talked to about this that is. So with this ruling, and this is where I actually, and then the ruling is long, really long. 100 meters, anytime she wants, but she has to run as a man. The 3,000 or the 5,000, she can run as a girl.
Right.
Okay. Logic is that elevated testosterone is much more beneficial for an event like the 800. It's not that explosive. We're not talking about the 100-meter dash, but that rules every. If they say you have to be a man in this race and you can be a girl in that makes no sense.
It's crazy how it is, and I should as an expert witness for Semenya at the CAS hearing, so I was in the room when I heard. And there are some things here that just somebody else could run. The 800 meters as a man on Friday, they show up and run the 5,000 as a woman. It's ill. I mean, this just goes to whatever people think about and there's really complicated and proper questions on all sides of it, but it's literally a disaster. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Right. It's just to the.
It doesn't. And what then is the question around, and the track and field or no distances or haven't ever run a mile? I'm sorry, but why the question around the 1,500, which is basically the equivalent of the mile? Question what's going to happen here in September at the World Championships? Is she going to be there running the 1,500? Or?
Yeah, well, so she has an appeal that in Swiss courts by the end of the month. We'll see how that turns out. But as of today, she was asked if she was going to take medication to reduce her testosterone.
She said, hell no.
She said, hell no.
Her exact response was, hell no.
Right.
Good for her.
So right now she's not going to be at the World Championships. But, the story of how IAAF came to these restricted 4 different events,
right, from
400 meters to a mile, is pretty amazing, and it'll kind of make your head spin. They tried to say this case, the Duty Chand case from India, that we want to regulate because testosterone gives such a great performance advantage, and women shouldn't be running with other women. So Duty Chand took them to CAS, and that testosterone provided all these benefits. There wasn't any research. Nobody knew. So CAS said to the IAAF, go away. Take 2 years, come up with the evidence.
Okay.
They went away, and they published a paper. And the paper said that there was some advantages for testosterone in the 800 meters, in the 400 meters, the pole vault, the hammer throw. And then they said, so we're going to regulate 400 meters, 800 meters, 1,500 meters in the mile, which was a non sequitur there. I and 2 colleagues asked the IAAF for their data, and they sent us a little bit of their data. Turns out it was shot through with errors. You can't make any conclusions on this. We published it. IAAF ignored it. CAS has ignored it. And in the CAS ruling for Semenya that just came out, CAS said, we noticed there's no evidence for the 1,500 meters. We'd like you to think about taking that out. Within 24 hours, the IAAF said,
oh, here it is.
Yeah. No, they said, thanks. We're not going to take it out. Okay. We're happy with what we have. So it's another one of these things where if you look under the cover and you start asking some questions, things just don't add up. It's not it has nothing to do with the gender issue. We don't even get there. It's that the process there. IAAF has been in such a hurry, it seems, to get Semenya out of competition that they've cut corners, they've made bad arguments, thinking nobody's going to pay attention to.
And this is what you testified to at the hearing.
Yeah, so integrity, our work is public, so we can talk about that. And we affects a certain subset of women this profoundly. You probably should make sure your numbers add up and the data is good. And it wasn't, and it's just not. And anyone who takes a look at it can see that. It's not controversial. In fact,
who did it? Who did the researhave? I mean, did
the IAAF.
Right, but they must have hired or
No, there was 2 of their internal doctors who have admitted that they have publicly admitted that they, out of 1,000 data points, more than 200, were bad. So, there's no controversy over whether the data.
I'm just getting more and more confused. You just changed this woman's life, this young woman. She's 28 years old. You changed her life forever. None of this makes any sense. By the way, if she ran, I looked it up here just now. If she ran the men's, you know what the men's world record is in the 800? 140. So she runs 154.
Right.
So if they say, okay, you have to go run with the guys, she's 14 seconds behind. And now it just seems on appeal. Is the appeal in front of Cass as well?
No, so the appeal goes to the Swiss courts, and apparently the Swiss courts can't consider the merits of the case. They can only consider procedural issues and if it violates Swiss public policy.
Well, what about the scientific study?
This is a good question because Cass apparently didn't take into consideration the science and decided to let bad science hold up bad regulations. If that's not grounds for an appeal, I don't know what would be, but it's a mess. And, so for people, this is what IAAF says now. They've moved away from the idea that evidence of advantage matters. Now they're going with straight biological sex. And what IAAF is saying now is if you have XY chromosome, you're man, full stop, you go over here. It has nothing to do with testosterone or performance advantage. Testosterone comes in when the IAAF says, oh, we can fix you. We can turn you back into a woman.
Oh my God.
That's the logic at work here. And if you talk to people, and I hear this a lot because I engage on this issue in social media and so on, there is this view that, well, I learned once that XY was male, XX is female, she's a 46 XY, she must be a man. And the problem is that medical science, World Health Organization, others have identified for a long time, many decades, there's such a thing as a 46 XY female.
This is probably a good time. So I was just trying to get my head around this thing yesterday. Yep. So I almost called you, and I was like, well, that would be really stupid to call and ask him questions before we sit here and ask questions. But I almost did. So I was like, all right, who's going to have some clarity or some guidance or clear opinion on this? And I was like, my old friend Sally Jenkins, who's very opinionated, but also brilliant.
Yep.
And I said, I'm curious to get your thoughts on the Semenya case. Here's a reply.
Yep.
Dumbass decision. God's gifts are distributed unequally. Entire history has been trying to artificially equalize nature, those who seem too different or physically superior or too professional, going back. Just like that decision, this one will, to future generations, look prejudiced and mean. And here's the worst part. There's a much bigger differential agent in sports than testosterone. And you know what it is? It's money. The wherewithal to learn and train and have decent equipment, the greatest speed skater in the world may be some Nunavut who doesn't have the funding of the Dutch. Supportive statement. There's a bunch of other as you go around. Martina Navratilova came out in strong support. I don't know. I'm just super confused. And I don't. The other thing too, and we can speak on this. I don't think Cass is a fair venue for an athlete. Athletes don't win at Cass. You're absolutely right. Cass has a built-in bias, but it's actually worse than that. Because Cass, so the way that courts work and the way that we learn about how judicial systems work is you have a case, there's a judgment, and that sets a precedent for what happens next. And we all know, lawyers go and they say, Marbury versus Madison in 1803 said this, and so we're going to build on that. Cass doesn't work that way. It's an arbitration tribunal. Right. So every conflict that it arbitrates is a one-off. So in the Ducey Chan case, the panel of 3 judges said, IAAF, you don't have evidence, so we can't uphold your regulations. In the Caster Semenya case, they said, IAAF, you don't have evidence, no worries.
we'll uphold your regulations. And so they're fundamentally in conflict with each other, and it doesn't matter because it's sports arbitration. So if you're an athlete, and so think about this. So let's say Caster Semenya says, all right, screw it, I'm going to run the 5,000. And she signs up to do the 5,000 at the World Championships. IAAF says, no, you don't. We're going to add the 5,000 to the prohibited list. She could then take them back to CAS, and there's no reason for CAS to follow what was done in the Semenya case or the Duty Chan case. It's all brand new.
Would they do that if she ran the 5,000?
Yeah, they've said they would do that.
They're going to add it?
They have said
These
that
pricks.
it's a
What a bunch
the
of-
quote they use is the regulations are a living document, which can change based on new information, which seems kind of ridiculous.
Look, I do want to reserve time towards the end and I have to be a little careful because I don't have any credibility on this and the whole doping thing and where all these people exist, and because most of CAS mostly adjudicates or arbitrates doping cases.
Yeah.
I'm assuming, and maybe a lot of those people are probably guilty, but here's a completely different case in most ways. She can't win. I mean, these arbitrators, right? So the way it works, you've got 3 arbitrators, like 3 judges. You don't have a jury. That's your jury, 3 people. You pick one, IAAF, the other side picks one, and then they somehow pick a guy who's quote unquote neutral, right? So you know how the one is going to vote that's your arbitrator. Right. You know how the one on the other side is going to vote. And so the most important person in the room is the middle dude.
Right.
Or dudette. I don't know who was there. But
dudette.
Oh, it was a dudette. Yeah. See? I'm glad I said dudette. But the trick, and this has been my experience, is that the first time that neutral person sides with the athlete, they never get hired again, right? And they make good money to arbitrate these cases. They're very high profile. It's in Switzerland. I think it's actually, talk about precedent. The times that neutral arbitrator, the most important person, sides with the athlete, they never go back. So they're sitting there going, man, I like this gig. I mean, Roger, that's just straight up bullshit.
Well, so here's where this case, and again, it's going to make your head spin. So the Duty Chan case, where they said you got to have evidence, has 2 of the same judges as in the Semenya case, where they came to the opposite conclusion. So in this case, they didn't change the people, and the head judge was the same. So
hang on. So we have 3 arbitrators. I'm not very smart, so I want to make sure I capture this. In both cases, obviously, 2 of the 3 were the same in both cases.
In both cases.
So the neutral one, was it the same lady for both?
Was the chair? Yeah.
Okay. And she flipped in this case.
She flipped her argument and came up with a different decision. And again, that's their right because it's CAS, and they don't have to be bound by precedent, which is one of the huge.
Or worrying about looking stupid.
Yeah, because they're moving on, and this panel will never meet again. I mean, this is put out there in the world, and then everyone, athletes, IAAF, the Swiss legal system, everybody has to deal with it, and it's. Arbitration works well. Like if you say, oh, you want to get paid $100 million to play baseball, and I say, no, you're worth only 80.
Right.
Go to an arbitrator, and they find out a number, and then you move on with your lives.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for complicated science, regulation, policy questions like this. It just doesn't work.
Yep. I'm so confused. It's just and how do you think her legal team handled it?
I think a
lot of it. I mean, she had good counsel. I'm under a confidentiality agreement.
I'll just put that out there. But I will say both sides. I thought the counsel they did the best they could in a system that's deeply flawed. I mean, here's one problem with the system. So we're talking about this. You see how complex it is. There was only 4 days of evidence and hearing. I think if this was in a normal court system, this would have been a month, 6 weeks, 2 months of a trial.
When I read 4 days, I thought, boy, that seems quick. We're deciding literally the fate of this girl's the rest of her life.
Well, and according to IAAF, it's in any given world championship there might be 3 or 4 women with this condition, but IAAF says over the last 15 years there's been 25 or 30 women. So they say it's not focused on Caster Semenya, and they're right. It's focused on about 3 or 4 women.
Yeah. Well, including the silver and bronze from the last Olympics. I mean, what about the other peer? I mean, I know you said that those 2 girls, Francine and Margaret,
Yep.
have expressed support, which,
Right.
if they're in the same boat, then they probably would. But what about like the lily white girl from Australia or England or Portland?
Yeah, and I mean, you have to be fair because there are some women in the 800 meters who have lost to Semenya for a decade over and over again.
And will lose for another decade too, by the way.
If she stays, they're not going to beat her, who have been pretty outspoken about what they see from their perspective as an injustice.
Okay, and what's their argument?
Their argument is, some have said, well, she must, she looks like a man, she must be a man. To others saying she has these natural genetic gifts that make her untouchable, so she has to be banned. So they make the argument based on fairness. I mean, honestly, if you run the marathon, it's pretty easy to come out in support of Semenya because you're never going to run against her.
Right.
So it is, and and again, if you're Billie Jean King or Martina Navratilova, it's plenty easy to offer your support. But I mean, I think you have to, be charitable to the athletes who have just, been looking at Semenya's backside for a decade, and I get it. But again,
now you're the neutral one.
Well, I'm not too neutral on this issue. There's,
yeah. I don't know. What was I going to say? My head is just, I can't get my head around it. It's just so, confusing,
It's not a new issue either. It goes back to probably the 1930s.
Yeah.
And this idea of sex testing by chromosomes, XX, XY, goes back to the 1970s. Before then, do you know this history? Before then, so this got wrapped up in the politics of the Cold War and the idea that maybe
they made them do surgery
First they thought the Soviet Union and the East Germans were going to smuggle men into women's events. That's never been documented. So what they did, this didn't happen at the World Championships, but it happened at the European Championships, a few other places. They did what were called naked parades. So they had the women take off their clothes, and at first they were inspected by a panel of 3 women, looked them over, make sure they had all the right parts, I guess. That didn't go over too well. Apparently some Olympians boycotted the naked parades. Then they had them submit to gynecological exams, which didn't go over too well. So they decided, we're going to take chromosome tests, XX and XY.
Yep.
And that proved to be a disaster because it doesn't work.
Yep.
It works 99% of cases, but there's those that doesn't.
And her peers, any accusations of doping?
Yeah. Maria Savinova ran against Caster in 2009, Russian, and Caster blew away the field and was one of the outspoken opponents of Caster and talking about how she looks and so on. She got wrapped up in the whole Russian doping scandal. So she's gone from the sport.
Just
right.
Amazing. Yeah. And as you read through this, like the issue, I mean, obviously the 3 medalists are all from the global south, or what they refer to as the global south. Is this either truly an issue there, or is this a bunch of fat, rich, lazy white dudes in Lausanne, Switzerland, or wherever the IAAF is based? Monaco. That's even whiter and richer and lazier. I actually like it there. But anyways, or is there some sort of a bias or prejudice there, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, so think about this. So for our generation, so we grew up in a world where differences like ambiguities in gender were erased from sight. So babies were quote unquote fixed when they were born. So I don't know how your elementary and junior high school was, but mine was, there wasn't a lot of people who were gender ambiguous in my school growing up in the 70s and 80s. And so when you ask people of our generation, about gender, you say, well, there's a men's room and a women's room. Pick one. It's obvious. It's easy. Now we live in a world, and there are different parts of the world where being in that shade of gray area isn't something to be quote unquote fixed. So the fact that the 2 athletes to challenge IAAF come from India and South Africa is not surprising. But it's just a matter of time, I think, before there's an athlete from Europe or the United States who does the same thing, because the way that norms change over time,
Right.
how we think about these things. You still have to draw a line between men and women for purposes of sport. I mean, the question is, how do you do it?
Yeah. No, I don't think there's just not an answer.
Oh, there has to be an answer, right?
Well,
you got to know who's going to be lining up to race, right?
I read another. Michael Johnson, the
Yeah.
former American great, was being interviewed, or he was doing an event for something, and they must have asked him the question. He took a. Look, if I was asked this publicly, I would not sit there and say this is the right decision. I think you're crazy to say that, even if you think it. I wouldn't.
Right.
And he said he thought it was a fair decision. He thought it was based on fairness. Now, he probably had not heard everything that we just talked about for half an hour about the science and the and the sloppy science and the process. But I was surprised he even said anything. Yeah. So what's next? What's next for her? If she chooses to not take the medicines, which she said she's not going to, and I think we can all agree with her there. And she doesn't want to go run the 3,000 or 5,000 because she's afraid that they'll just add that to her quote unquote ban or whatever they're calling this. What does she do?
So if the rules are upheld, let's say the Swiss Federal Tribunal says, we don't have the authority to challenge CAS on this, we're going to let it stand.
Which is typically what they do.
Almost all the time.
Yeah, this is what they do.
Right.
They don't want it's way too stressful and potentially have potential backlash if they overturn things like that. So they typically just go, this is too bad. We're so sorry, but
yeah. And this one, I mean, this one is kind of an existential issue for CAS. So if the Swiss government gets involved, it could lead to some big issues for CAS. So if they don't overturn it, which seems, going on history would be likely, she's out of sport. She's done. She can't participate. Now, there very well may be other athletes who come and offer challenges before CAS or elsewhere. There's talk about human rights issues. There's probably European issues. I have a new paper that's going to be coming out pretty soon. We haven't even talked about this.
Talk about it.
About the medical ethics issues. So here's what the rules require. They require the athlete to either take pills, get an injection, or have surgery to reduce their testosterone. Well, these are healthy people. So what the rules do is they turn healthy people into patients.
Yeah.
And we don't have any experience as a society with the intentional off-label use of these methods to reduce testosterone. So we're conducting experiments on these women. In my world, the university world, the research world, when you do research on human subjects, you have to get ethical approval. I mean, it's the same thing they say in doping. Like, we can't test for performance enhancement because it's unethical to take some medication and give it to an athlete and see what it does, right?
That's convenient.
And so here they're doing reverse doping. They're trying to slow her down. So IAAF has said we don't have to follow ethics guidelines. We're outside that world.
Brad, you know how these guys work, guys and gals. I mean, these institutions, these governing bodies, these bureaucrats that run them. They and look. I'm trying to say this as neutrally as I can, but they just make up the rules as they go along. And everybody listening knows my history. I'm not trying to say that I got fucked over or whatever, but I do know they make up the rules as they go along. Speaking of that, where is WADA and all these guys in this? They had to, they love the spotlight and the press. They had to have been figuring out a way that they could get in there and get their message in there and get their face on TV.
Boy, the silence from other sports organizations has been remarkable. I mean, WADA can't say a lot because they are on record about the ethics of medicating for performance enhancement. So they really, if they did step in, they probably should be saying, hey, hold up, IAAF, you can't force athletes to medicate without getting ethics approval, having it be the subject of a study. But they haven't said anything.
So they're just crickets.
Right. So so outside of sport, the World Medical Association, which is the largest group of physicians worldwide, has asked doctors not to implement these regulations because they're unethical. And again, the IAAF went public and said, we don't have to listen to
We're
that.
still not, of course they don't,
Right.
because they make up the rules as they go along.
Right.
That is a fact.
Right.
Yeah, we still don't have a conclusion here. I still can't. I can't imagine that she never runs again. And I can't. And I don't.
Right.
And I believe her when she says she's not going to sort of reverse dope.
Right.
As you said. Yeah. I mean,
Well, I mean, she is.
It's frustrating.
It's enormously frustrating because she is a once in a generation talent.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's the athletes. I mean, you know this much better than I do. That come along and are so dominant for so long. I mean, there's something special.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and it's amazing. And I met her. I spent a week with her in Switzerland. Remarkable person. Just the fact that she's so positive in the face of all this is amazing. But the fact that her own governing body decided to basically try to sabotage her instead of celebrate her, to inspire, poor women from Africa, India, elsewhere who might not have a chance, is really it's a generational loss that this has gone on.
Yeah. Well, that's what Sally said.
Yeah.
And it's something that in 20, 30 years we may look back and go, God, that was the wrong decision.
I do think IAAF has been pretty surprised at the scope of the negative reaction from all over the world that it's got to the.
Tell you what, I read a bunch of the articles on the Washington Post. I read some articles on Let'sRun.com. I want to get to this Deadspin piece I read about this former swimmer Nancy Hogshead. Have you seen her?
Yeah.
She's just come out guns a-blazing. I want to talk about that in a second. So I read all this stuff, and so on one of the Post articles, I clicked a few comments. I was like,
right,
because I'm reading this thing going, I'd imagine all these comments are going to be supportive.
Right.
Not one supportive comment.
Right.
Not one.
Right.
And there were, I think at the time, 47 or 48, not one.
Right.
So IAAF is probably taking some consolation in that. I mean,
well, I think, and IAAF, I think, has invited this, is that the issue, so Caster Semenya, born a girl, raised as a girl, went to school as
a girl
all her life, never has changed lanes. IAAF has tried to conflate or mix up this issue with the male to female transition issue, which it's an important issue. Sport has to deal with it. And I tell people it's not this issue. It's a different issue. It's really important. You got to have rules in place for men who transition to females and want to compete in sport, but that's not this one.
Yeah.
And that's where I think a lot of the heated rhetoric, and I hear it online and I read the comments. Most people go right there right away, instead of talking about the case here.
Yeah. And what you said a second ago is you can either take a pill, take an injection, probably some sort of a regular, frequent injection, or surgery.
Right.
And so, I mean, I want people to think about that, right? So surgery, like, why would you? I mean, the reality is, she does, with this XY situation, there are testes somewhere.
There can be, inside the body, somewhere, or partial, as I understand it. I'm not a doctor, but and that the surgery would remove the testosterone producing material inside your body, so it's permanent. You never can go back. And the injection and taking the hormones, they don't even. Cass even said that in his decision. We don't even know if this is going to work. So we gotta pay close attention to it. And the Cass, the 6-page executive summary you referred to said, well, women may have trouble getting below that 5 nanomole threshold, and so we have to have sensitivity because we don't know. We've never done this before. We've never experimented on women like this, which speaks to the fact that maybe these regulations came out before IAAF was ready. Even if you support the regulations, it's hard to think that it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, I smart girl.
Yeah, I mean,
she's I don't know. She doesn't say very much, so it's hard to get a read on. She's quiet, and
no, it is remarkable. I mean, particularly in this day and age, she lets her performances largely speak for herself. She's done a few interviews lately. She put out a little commercial the other day, basically defiantly saying, it started out a message to humanity. I'm not going anywhere, which, you got to, whatever you think about
that was the
issue.
Yeah.
No, this was her. She put it out with a group in South Africa.
Wow.
She's stood up pretty strong in the face of this, which, God, I can't even imagine. It's got to be difficult.
I can imagine. Yeah. Was her wife there with her?
Not in Switzerland.
Not at the hearing.
Yeah.
So she's just there alone with you and a bunch of lawyers.
Yeah.
Fun.
Yeah.
All right. So here, one of the top, so this was on Deadspin.com. One of the top voices for women in sport doesn't think Caster Semenya is a woman. And, I haven't gone down that rabbit hole that much, but I mean, here's a lady who lobbies and spends all of her time fighting for women's rights. I think that's a tough position to take there for her.
So Nancy Hogshead McCarr is probably the nation's leader on safe sport abuse of athletes. She came to my class about a month after you did. And I have an enormous respect for her. And you can, of course, anybody can say whatever they want. Like, I don't think you're a man or I don't think you're a woman based on this or that criteria. And, what I wrote in my paper on this, that you could say, well, in order to truly be a woman, you have to give birth, because that proves it beyond a shadow of a doubt. Sure, you can make up rules like that, but the reality is that society, medical science does all that hard work for us. Mm-hmm. So the fact that Caster's born a woman, raised a woman, entered sport as a woman, legally a woman, she's kind of a woman. Right. So the fact that anybody out there might say, well, I don't like how she looks, or I don't like her chromosomes or her genetics, they can say that, but they're really pushing, a big rock up a hill if they're going to try to change medical science, society, the law, and history to try to redefine who this person is. It's just, and I guess my issue is, why go there? Yeah. Why does IAAF have to pick this hill to die on, given the Russian doping scandal, the evidence that as many as 50% of their athletes might be doping from their own research?
Mm-hmm. And it's because Caster Semenya cannot have a child.
I don't know.
I think that's right. I don't know.
It's there have been.
I don't know why I think that. I just thought with the X and the Y.
I think there are examples of 46XY females who have had the ability to have.
Okay, well then they fall under the umbrella.
Yeah, I know. So you could also say, well, anyone who's over 6'6" is by definition a man.
Yeah. And
you're going to be right 99.99% of the time.
Yeah. And Michael Phelps is triple jointed and has size 17 feet, and that's why he swims so fast, which is one of the reasons he swims fast. But that doesn't mean anybody that's triple jointed shouldn't be able to swim in the Olympics.
Right. Or look at Katie Ledecky. She destroys competition. Yeah. Destroys everyone she faces. Just more dominant than Semenya. And so when people raise the issue of dominance or podium spots or things like that, that's never the issue. Because, Jamaicans have dominated sprinting. Is anybody pushing for a rule to slow down Jamaicans? Maybe some of their competitors. But nobody, so when people raise those issues, to me, it's a sideshow, because what they're really talking about is biological sex, not excessive performance, which we see across the board.
All right. Well, we'll stay tuned. We'll have this appeal here soon, probably in the next 2
This issue is going to be going on for years to come. It's been around since the 1930s, and I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon.
Dang. There you go. Let's talk about doping. You spent a lot of time thinking about that, reading, or studying that, writing about that.
We just have a new paper out on similar topics, scientific integrity and anti-doping.
Yeah. What's that all about?
So, there's a number of issues that, anti-doping, if it's going to succeed, has to be based on evidence, and in a lot of different ways. And if you start looking at the practice of anti-doping today, it's kind of departed from relying on evidence in a way that threatens the whole regime.
Yeah. And you've told me these numbers before, but give me 3 numbers. Give me, what is the worldwide annual budget of all of the anti-doping, the USADAs, the WADAs, the ASADAs, all the ADAs worldwide?
Yeah, so it's a little out of date, so the number's going to be more than this, but the most recent number is about $350 million. Okay. Mostly spent on testing, not on research.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And based on their own studies, these anonymous studies where people basically admit if they dope or have doped or not, what percentage is that, or how prevalent do we think it is or still is?
Yeah, so WADA put in place a team to actually identify prevalence in 2011, and they did produce their results, and then immediately WADA and IAAF prohibited them from publishing that study. It took about 7 years to come out. Ulrich was the lead author, and it looked at athletes at the Pan-Arab Games and the World Championships, and in one number, 50% of athletes are breaking WADA rules by their own admission.
And I think I said this to your class, but can we just talk about the people that think that they're taking maybe it is truly anonymous or secret? Who the hell would admit? I wouldn't trust those people.
Right.
I wouldn't. So you have to imagine I mean, nobody's not doping and saying, I'm going to just mess with these guys and say that I am. So that gets
Right.
You have to just imagine that there's another chunk that go, I don't trust these guys. I'm not going to admit it on this secret study they have going, right? So perhaps it's even higher. All right, so we'll just work off 50% and 350 million. And the catch rate or the rate of positives is
About 1%.
okay.
Yeah.
I get in so much grief, and I get these flaming texts from Tigert every time I say this. I say, look, I'm not saying that anybody's a bad guy or a good guy or a good fight or a bad fight. I'm just using these three numbers, right? If that's my $350 million that I gave, which in a way it is our $350 million, that I gave to you to go combat this 50% problem, and you're telling me you're batting 1%? I mean, you just can't look at that and say that's a good job. That's a bad job.
Well, Travis Tigert, the head of USADA, came to my class, I don't know, a couple of weeks after you did also, and I asked him this exact question. I said, all right, so the published research from WADA says, between 40 and 60% are doping. What do you think that number is? And he said, I think it's about 10%. So even if you take his number, it means that it's 10 to 1. For every one person that is caught, 10 people get away with doping in elite sport. That's a big gap. So that's one of the things that anti-doping agencies don't do particularly well, is to ask, well, how big is the problem? And then what follows from that, how well are we doing? Is it getting bigger or is it getting smaller? Right. And how do we know?
Well, we don't. Well, a couple things. You just don't know. So he's guessing. We would be guessing. Right. You just don't know. Having said that, it's in his interest to keep that number as low as possible. Right. I mean, he should say pretty soon, knowing him, he'll get to the place where he's like, I think it's about 1%, and we catch all of them, right? But these guys and gals are not going to freely admit, and then that number be 50%, and then you'd be foolish to think it's 10%, because it's just not. So what do we do? I mean, I get asked this question. People, we have this conversation, and whether it's in private or in public, and it ends in the same place: is should we just allow some level of performance enhancement?
So we do already. I mean, so this is the WADA list. It has prohibited substances and methods. If you go to that list, I did this, and you count up all the different substances and methods that are on that list, you get a number that's more than 300. Every drug or method on there comes with a cost. The cost is we have to monitor for it, we have to test it, we have to sanction people, we have to go to CAS. There's no way in the world that a list with 300 substances can ever be enforced. It's too big. It costs too much. There's too much stuff on there.
And you don't give enough urine. I mean, you give...
Well, you have to make choices. What do you test for? What don't you test for?
What's the minimum? I mean, we always give them the minimum, of course.
Right.
It's like...
I don't know what that is. Yeah.
I mean, the little line on the cup, I mean, it's shocking. And this is a big cup, but it's a little narrow cup, little plastic cup. It is... So, yeah, and I'm looking at this going, yeah, you can't test. You have to, in your head, say, well, we think... they're probably doing X, Y, and Z, so let's stress those. Right.
Well, just as a thought experiment, I've asked, what if we said, all right, what are the top 30 substances that we want to test for? I don't know, amphetamines, EPA, whatever it is, that steroids that have the biggest effect and that have the most impact on sport. What if we went to doctors and we went to athletes and we said, all right, what are your top 30? Would there be agreement? Probably there'd be pretty strong agreement on the top 10 or 15. And then after that, maybe not. Yeah. But it'd be much easier to implement a list that's much smaller, the things that actually change the nature of sport, and then say, hey, if you want to take your double latte or whatever before competition, or something that has a small effect.
Yeah, DHEA or something that's...
Go for it, because we can't test for all these things. Because the problem is now that the list has expanded so much, there's more risk of false positives. So athletes that are wrongly accused and have to go through that whole system, and it just gums up the system. The due process rights of athletes are violated. So I think there's a lot of things that could be done. It's not going to help with the purists. I mean, if the idea is no performance-enhancing substances ever for anybody, good luck with that. But the reality is it could become more evidence-based, more science-based in a way that is at a reasonable cost and keeps people, keeps their faith in sport alive.
Yeah.
But we're pretty far from that.
But this idea that you allow them... And again, I'll tell you what my answer is in a second. But that we allow them to have, even the high octane ones. I mean, some sort, testosterone. And I'm not advocating for this. I'm just saying this is testosterone or steroids or EPO or, because that then becomes, if you're spending all this money, you're not catching anybody heads get to at some point.
So a colleague of mine, Paul Dimio, in the advisory board for USA Cycling, and he said something to the media, hey, maybe we should do some research on whether the testosterone helps athletes recover, because maybe that'll make it safer for them, it'll improve sport. He was booted off of their advisory board just for saying that sort of thing. So
he may as well just walked up and said, I just went for a bike ride with Lance this morning. That'd have got it kicked off even quicker.
Right. I mean, this is part of the anti-doping, instead of being like a regulatory thing, has become kind of a morality thing. And we hear this, that WADA and USADA, but what about athletes who are quote unquote dirty, just the language of clean and dirty. But what about athletes who are caught? Do they have rights too? It's a little bit like having a legal system. Our job is to protect the rights of innocent people.
Yeah.
I mean, people might not like guilty people, but they have rights too. And sometimes the system screws up. So that's another place where more evidence would improve anti-doping, is to make sure that people, and we've documented a few, and there's quite a few actually, who have been falsely accused, actually have due process rights and can get out of the system once they get caught up in it. And
my answer to this, just right quick, is when I watch sporting events, I never think about it. I'm never like, I think that guy's doping, or I just don't think that. So I have kids, and my kids are athletes and play sports, and what would my son plays college ball, and what would I think if he came to me one day and said, are doing it, and what do you think? You're not gonna do that.
I think I told you this when you came to ask my class, 150 students. How many of them? I didn't ask. Don't you know a friend who has used a performance enhancing? And these are college kids, and talking about high school. So and every year I get a shocking number of people who raise their hands, and it's out there. It's for kids these days and athletes that they're not going away anytime soon.
All right, so let's just get to where because and I'm not a scientist. Genetic quote unquote doping, I think, is a real thing.
Yeah.
I don't think manipulate the body genetically so that it naturally produces more EPO.
It's coming if it's not already here. There's a story. Basketball players mate with other basketball players.
Well, that's different than.
Is it different then? So let's say.
Well, I mean, let's
say you can go in using the CRISPR technology they have now and genetically modify an embryo such that it has different characteristics. So it's one's you're being really precise, and the other one you're kind of relying. And so that gets to the question: what's acceptable? What's not acceptable?
Okay, maybe they're both unacceptable, but mating people because you want to make a bunch of tall people is very different than going in and modifying somebody's embryo so that they are producing machine. Like to me, that's different.
I mean, all right, so we just arrived on the GMO debate in agriculture.
Yeah.
If you're blending peas together through natural selection, that's one thing. And if you go in and you put a pig's gene in a tomato, that's something else. So yeah, but it's coming. I mean, that's the point. It's just a short jump from, we're going to try to do this using blunt technologies like mating people to, we're going to go in and with precision design some super duper athletes so that we can win the Olympics in 2048 or whatever.
Right.
And so what does WADA do then? Do they say, all right, we're going to ban
Chinese people?
Genetic programs that, Russians, Americans, whoever it happens to be.
Do you get in trouble for saying Chinese people? People from China. That's probably better.
I mean, it's coming if it's not here already.
Yeah,
and
I think a lot of people think it's here already.
Yeah.
Now maybe the athletes aren't
right.
here yet.
Right.
They're still 10 years old or something.
So then, what do you do if you're WADA in 2048 and on your prohibited list is genetic modification of human beings? So, I mean, think about the resources needed then. And what are you going to do? You're going to go investigate around the world. So, yeah, it's we're just at the beginning of this. Yep. And one day we'll look back and say, wasn't that cute? We were worried about steroids and EPO and things like that. And
that Lance Armstrong guy, he didn't do shit. I mean, this guy's actually a pretty good guy.
If only you were genetically modified. Then.
I mean, we were talking about... not to get too political, but this is very political. We were talking about it before we went on here. We're like, because you asked me about my Air Force One cup over there, and it's like, when Bush was president, everybody's like, this is the worst president of all. A lot of people thought he was a good president, but people were very anti. And now we're sitting here with the Donald. It's like, God, just give us Bush.
Right.
Please.
Right. Yeah. Events have some way of putting things into perspective.
And you study, and I'll wrap this up because I know I got to run, you got to run, you study the environment as well.
Yeah.
And so global warming is real.
Global warming is real.
It's not fake news.
It's not fake news.
See, that's where I get on this, because there are people that believe that it's just cyclical and the world has these 100-year periods or whatever where it has hot moments and glaciers melt and trees get cut down and all of a sudden it comes back. So where I go on this, because I'm not smart, very smart. So I think to myself, if I had the 100 smartest environmental Nobel laureate, whatever, in the room, and they all say that global warming is real, and I don't know, I say it's real.
Yeah.
Like then I'll go, okay, I'm with those 100.
Yeah.
Can we reverse it?
Can't reverse it. We can slow it down. Can adapt to it.
Okay, now that's a bummer. I thought we could reverse it.
We can't reverse it. It's
damage is done.
Well, the damage up to today is done. We're not going to reverse that. So with the decisions we make from now going forward are going to have a big impact on how the environment, how the climate develops in the future. But there's no
we could
going
turn
back.
it around.
There's no turning around. That's we're committed to some degree and we've already seen changes occur. So that's not in the cards.
What's the single biggest thing humankind can do to slow it?
So right now the biggest bang for the buck is nuclear energy. And so if you want to get
for nuclear energy,
to replace coal, natural gas, oil,
I agree.
With nuclear power.
I agree. People, it's got such a. You know what they need? Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, no.
But I want you to talk about nuclear energy. What nuclear energy needs? Here's what they need. Like these people in the past they go to these people, the word doctors.
Yeah.
And they change the name. Gambling was a kind of a skeezy word.
Right.
Changed it to gaming. Liquor, kind of skeezy. Changes to spirits. So nuclear just has to go to the word doc and figure out another, because there's such a stigma around that name, that brand.
Right.
So if they could just, call it, nanomole or whatever we talked about, it, just some other name.
Puppy dogs and candy. Yeah. People have to decide. This is the political question. Are they more afraid of nuclear energy or more afraid of climate change? Or do they want to bet that wind and solar and batteries and technologies we don't have now are going to show up? All of those are legitimate positions. But people have to decide you can't say, I'm really afraid of climate change, but I'm also really afraid of nuclear, so I don't want to do anything. Because that means you're going to get climate change and a bunch of fossil fuels. You could say, well, I'm going to roll the dice and bet that we're going to have really big batteries that store enough energy for a city. Okay, maybe we will, but
stuff happens. That's the problem with nuclear. That's what happened in Chernobyl, right?
Yeah.
In Japan after the tsunami.
Yeah, there's no risk-free energy. So, people don't see it as much because it's not like an event, but coal, for example, has, you've seen the pictures in Beijing and India. People die from particulate pollution.
In West Virginia.
In West Virginia, they blow up the tops of mountains. Yeah. So, wind farms kill birds and they take a lot of land, and people in California protest that they're in environmental areas. So people don't want offshore wind. So every technology has its downsides. And in our politics in this country have arrayed that we got people who are for this technology and against that technology.
Right.
And nothing happens because everybody wants to fight about what their favorite technology is.
Right. And in these traditional fossil fuel forms of energy,
just keep plugging along.
Well, and their budget for lobbyists and lobbying is whatever.
They're entrenched.
It's endless.
Yep.
And nuclear, aside from having a bad brand, probably doesn't have the budget to go fight for themselves.
Right. Well, not in the United States, at least. Elsewhere,
they do. Yeah, they have them in France and
China's building a lot of nuclear power plants. So
it's so funny when we would see them in France. I would always be like, "Oh shit! Like we might be in trouble. Like what if that thing? There's a stigma." Like I was like, dude, these people have nuclear energy. Are they crazy?
France is probably the world's biggest success story in getting off of fossil fuels.
Shows you what I know.
Right.
And so it's not happening.
Right now, there's a lot of talk. There's not a lot of action happening. And that's really frustrating because the issue has become really political, and then it kind of detaches from the policy process, and people fight about it, and they say really strong things. They say, oh, we want a Green New Deal, oh, you're a denier, you're a believer, and all this. And all of that discussion and debate has a lot of heat, but it's pretty far removed from what's actually happening on the ground. And that's the huge frustrating part.
Yeah. I said they go to the word doctor. That's. I never thought a word doctor could stop global warming. But now that I think about it,
well, I mean,
if I can contribute anything to the society,
if you can figure out a way to make better energy policy appeal to Democrats and Republicans in the United States, that's Nobel Prize stuff right there.
Yeah. Let's end with that. Lance for the Nobel Peace Prize. Not ever going to happen. Roger, thanks for coming down.
Thanks for having me.
You're a good man. Been a good friend. This is a
Appreciate it.
fascinating. Just to come back. I mean, it's just I still don't have an answer. It's confusing, and I will say this. I mean, everybody. We're talking again about Caster Semenya. Everybody on both sides expresses a significant amount of compassion and empathy for her situation. She's handled it tremendously well, so they should. But even the people that basically gave her a lifetime ban say we don't like the way this has ended up, and it's just it's tough. It's tough. Feel for her.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Thanks, buddy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.